Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Me and the Bible. This week, we are focusing on the Jewish Taskmasters. They are a group of wonderful, incredible, holy people, and I hope that we get some clarity by the end of the class. I'm very excited for this topic. I think it's different. It's not your classical character from the Torah, from the Bible, and I think we'll be able to really get a great perspective here as well. As I mentioned, always, if you have a question or a thought, please jump in and share it. At the end, I like to go around as well to get your thoughts. But if you have any questions, please do let me know. If you want to follow up after the recording, in no means should impact your participation. As I said, the class tonight is focused on the Hebrew word is Chaiton, which is the policeman, the Jewish policeman, the taskmasters, and they may not be as famous as Moses and Aaron and Miriam and Rachel and so on, but nevertheless, an important part of our story in Egypt, and definitely one exploring tonight as well. So we're going to do a deep dive, really zoom in on these Jewish taskmasters to understand who they were, what their role was, what their greatness was, what sacrifices they made. And in order to properly do that, in order to get a clear understanding, we first needed to zoom out and redefine what the Egyptian slavery looked like. Many times we look at the slavery, we think, okay, so Pharaoh made the Jewish people work hard, a couple days, a couple years, but there's a bigger perspective. There was a psychological war that Pharaoh was playing with the Jewish people. And we're going to start with that. And hopefully, as we dig deeper into that element, the context of it, we can then appreciate the greatness of these Jewish taskmasters. But just to open it up, I just want to, something on the lighter note, is that, and this puts it into perspective. So I once saw a t-shirt, so what we would call a meme today, but it was on a t-shirt, and it said like this, it said, "Video games ruined my life. Good thing I've got 3 more." And of course, the joke over there is that this person is so engulfed and encapsulated by his video gaming life that's the whole reality that he sees. He doesn't recognize that no, real life is one life and you're still in that game where you have 3 more lives. And that really is a perfect segue into the Egyptian bondage. It wasn't just, oh, work is hard, work is bad, we don't enjoy being in Egypt. There was a complete demoralization of the Jewish people. And as I go through the steps, you're going to start thinking, hey, this happened in this part of our history. This happened so many years ago. This happened in this country, in this regime. And the truth is, we're told that the Egyptian exile, Egyptian bondage is really an opening and really was the start of all types of exiles. So it's very possible that ideas, negative, bad, evil ideas that Pharaoh implemented were later used by those wishing to harm us, wishing to harm the Jewish people, and not just the Jewish people, wishing to harm others as well, other elements of civilization. Okay, so we have to remember that for most of the Jewish people, especially in the Jewish individuals, men and women who were going out of Egypt, slavery was all they knew. Remember, Moses was born into slavery. And he is many, many years older. He's coming along to 100 years old, a little less, when he goes to Pharaoh. So most of his life is in slavery. And so all the babies born his age and many others, their life is slavery. Bondage is the only thing that they know. So how did it happen? Let's run through a brief timeline, which is very important to give us the context. So first of all, it wasn't just overnight. Here the Jewish people are friends of the Egyptians living alongside them, and then boom, click of your finger, snap a button, and all of a sudden they are slaves being tormented, tortured in the worst way possible. It was a process. First, we're told that there was a 30 years of labor. It wasn't enjoyable labor, but it wasn't the backbreaking mental type of labor that comes later. So for 30 years, which is a long time, almost a whole career for some people in this day and age, they were in labor. After that, there was what we call in Hebrew the avodas perach. loosely translated as the backbreaking labor. That was really the onset of the psychological, diabolical labor that Pharaoh put on the Jewish people, and we'll break that down as well. And then after that comes the death, the killing of the unborn children with the midwives, and then the born children being thrown into the Nile River. And then also Pharaoh openly murdering Jewish babies after that. So it wasn't just a one overnight process, as I mentioned. It was a long, thought out process. And this is exactly what it says in the opening of the book of Exodus. Pharaoh calls his ministers together. They're in this emergency session. You think about it in the White House, they're right there in the bunker. They're really, really worried. This is the situation room. And Pharaoh says, we have a crisis. The Jewish people are becoming too large. They're going to overthrow the government. So right then and there, Pharaoh says, Hava nischak malai, which means that we should outsmart them. He recognized he wasn't just going on genocide like Haman wanted to do. He didn't want to destroy them in that sense. He wanted to control them in every way, control their marital life, control their ethics, control their way of thinking, control every part of their life. Let's outsmart them. And that was the process. So let's break it down into the steps. And we have about 6 different steps that Pharaoh did, each one a layer on the next, until we have this pyramid. And on top of that pyramid is where these slaves, these Jewish taskmasters, fit in. So first of all, what happens? He has a nation, a Jewish nation, a thriving, blessed, smart, innovative nation. Joseph was the second in command. There's no way that Joseph wasn't known by all Egyptians. He was probably posters of Joseph in the Egyptian public schools, so to speak. He was very well known. He was a viceroy. He was young when he started. He was very charismatic. He was handsome. He was popular. What happens when Joseph and his brothers die? Suddenly, Pharaoh rewrites history. He basically erases the past. Whether it was the same Pharaoh or a new Pharaoh, it is stripped from Egyptian literature. The idea of this great Joseph who saved the Egyptian people and most of humanity through a terrible famine is gone. That's the first step of demoralizing the Jewish people. Don't think that you have any connections. Don't think that you can curry any favors with us in the palace. We don't know who you are. You're strangers. Do not expect any good treatment. That's the first step. Remove any of that ability to come and petition on their behalf. That's what happens. Pharaoh completely ignores all of that. Then the second step in Pharaoh's psychological war against the Jewish people is to turn into a very, very delicate area, which we still struggle today. And that is the area of patriotism. He turns to the Jewish people and he says, look, you're living in this land. I'm living in this land. We're all fellow Egyptians. You serve that God. Okay, I'm not making a big deal of it, but practically, when it comes down to it, here's your country, here's your land. And so he says, we are now embarking on a national building project. And Pharaoh comes out of his palace with great pomp and noise and ceremony, and they hand him a shovel, and they hand him an axe, and all the other tools that he would need. And there is Pharaoh working and making bricks and building buildings and erecting structures. And of course, which man or woman is going to see the Egyptian Pharaoh, the mighty king, working so hard and not get involved? So they all do. It's a patriotic duty. How could you not? He plays on that emotion element of it. You're in exile, so to speak. You're out of the land of Israel. You have a responsibility here. And so the Jewish people happily and excitedly, and perhaps to show themselves as good citizens, as loyal of Pharaoh, they start working hard. But then Pharaoh tricks them. And Pharaoh turns to his ministers and his soldiers, and he says, you know, the Jewish people just joined us in our effort to rebuild Egypt. I want you to go and count how many bricks they each built. Today, yesterday, over a period of, I don't know, a week, 2 weeks, let's say, and write it down, mark it on a piece of paper. Sure enough, the Egyptians do that, and they have a log, they have a record. Mr. A did so much, Mrs. B, C, D, they all did how many bricks? And then everything changes. Pharaoh then says, aha, you are now going to carry out the same amount of work. When you're all excited, when you saw me there, when you're all motivated to do it, now you're expected to do the same amount. I know you could do it because when you were into it and you were excited about it, and when you were very psyched up, you did it. So you did 80 bricks that day. Now every single day you are going to make 80 bricks. You did 100. Well, then you better get going, because every single day now you're going to do 100. And that was the next step of his breakdown. It was a slow, tricky process. The verse uses the word avodas perach, which again loosely translates as backbreaking labor. But there's a deeper meaning to that word, and that is peh rach. Peh means a mouth. Rach is like soft, tricky. He used his mouth to trick the Jewish people into working. The next part of his plan is to break their spirit, because a slave, if they are thinking, if they are functioning, if they are intellectually still stable, if they know what's coming and they're in their comfort zone, then a slave can still feel like a human being and can still plan escape, can still think for themselves. And of course, Pharaoh doesn't want that. He wants to break them completely. And so he starts messing things around. He does jobs which might be easier for women, he gives to men. Somebody who was maybe better at this type of work was given a different type of work, so that every day when you show up to work, these Jewish slaves, men and women, they were never comfortable. They never felt, okay, I'll get through the day. I know what I'm doing. It was hard. It was like using your left hand if you're right-handed every single day. It was being off balance every moment. The breakdown of that, of course, is impossible to work. Then he adds another element, which makes the whole labor even much more severe. And then he starts giving them this useless work without purpose, where they're simply showing up, working their roles, fulfilling their quotas, hopefully, but without seeing any progress. They would build a structure, the next day it was sunk into the ground. He would give them swampy lands to build up, quicksand, areas that were not suitable for building, for growth, for erecting structures of any kind. And of course, that mental breakdown is extreme. Because even if I am going to work hard, even if you're going to make me do something I'm not comfortable with, at least the progress, the fruits of my labor keep me going. Here, Pharaoh denied them of that very basic need to see success, to see that my efforts are going somewhere. After that, he cuts off their lifeline of any hope of salvation. And what is that? He says, don't you ever think that you're going to be redeemed, because I know that your Redeemer, the Savior of the Jewish people, is going to be born and going to be a boy. And so I'm going to kill every single baby boy and drown them in the Nile. So don't you even think that there's someone coming, even if it's not tomorrow, even if it's in a few years, don't you think someone's coming to rescue you? You are helpless. You are fully dependent on me. You cannot go anywhere. You cannot be yourself. You are mine from every fiber of your being, not just your actual hands, not just the labor, but your mind as well. I control it. You are mine completely. Yet, there was one thing that was still keeping the Jewish people together, and that is the camaraderie, the brotherhood, the sisterhood, the fact that we are a nation, the fact that we are all in this predicament together is very empowering. It's very encouraging that we can all be in a situation together. Of course, it's not a situation we would ever want to be in. But Pharaoh recognizes that community, oneness, togetherness is extremely powerful. And so he has to come up with another final blow. And that is the step of dividing and subduing the people completely and finally. And he does this, coming to our topic tonight, On the top of that pyramid, as I said, that tippy top was appointing Jewish taskmasters. Because now that the Jewish people are sunken into the slavery mentality, this is the world they know. This is the reality they know. They don't think for themselves. They have no hope of redemption. Now, Pharaoh says, I'm going to take fellow Jews and appoint them over you. So now you're going to have to start picking sides. Now you're going to turn against each other. Families will start being broken apart. You know what your father did to my sister today? And you know what my mother got happened because of you? And there starts being discord and division. And then it's over. Then there's no chance of any type of saving. And I want to read you something. And I'm not going to tell you who said it, but you'll understand very easily where it comes from. And I quote, I can say quite candidly that it is not my job to feather bed anybody, but to rid the streets of subhumans and use them to bring us to victory. That's my task, and I keep it in view. Camps hold the lowlifes from all the European nations, Jews and Russians and Poles and Czechs and Frenchmen. Wherever criminals are found in the territories under German occupation, they are sent to us. Because we can't get by with Germans only. We naturally arrange things so that a Frenchman is a capo in charge of Poles, or a Pole in charge of Russians, so that a nation is played off against another. Himmler to his generals when they started putting capos in the concentration camps. Horrific. But you see right there, he spells it out. Pitting human against human, countryman against another countryman to sow discord, to divide and subdue. And that's precisely what Pharaoh wanted, because he understood that they are going to break each other up. The fighting, the division is absolute for him. So what does he tell them to do? He tells them, you are now responsible to make sure that the group of Jews under your control fill their quota. If you need to beat them, beat them. If you need to punish them, punish them. If you need to harass them, harass them. It is your job. On top of you, he says, I'm going to appoint Egyptian taskmasters who are going to oversee all of you. But you are responsible to make sure your fellow Jewish brothers and sisters are working. So if you are not going to report the bad behavior, if you look down your list at the end of the day and there's a quota short, somebody was supposed to do 80 bricks and they only did 70, either you report it and deal with it, or you're going to deal with the brunt of it. That moment, these Jewish taskmasters were put into an impossible situation. It's unthinkable to imagine a choice that a fellow person has to make at that moment. Do I tell, snitch, inform on my fellow, or do I take the brunt of the punishment for myself? And unfortunately, history has shown us that when people are in a survival state of mind, they will do whatever they have to do to survive, because why is your blood redder than mine? We're all in this. We're all suffering. We're all in a terrible hole. Why should I suffer because of you? And what choice did they make ultimately? They chose to take the hits. They chose to be beaten every day. The Jews who didn't finish their quota were not beaten by their fellow Jew. Rather, the Jewish taskmasters reported, and then they were beaten for not having compelled their fellow Jews to do their work. It's a frightening situation, horrible, unthinkable, but yet they had the courage to make an impossible choice. Putting things into historical context, I believe, is so valuable to really appreciating the grand miracle of the Exodus from Egypt. Pharaoh was an absolutely diabolical dictator, a tyrant, a cruel ruler. Sadly, he's not the only one in history with such a reputation. And throughout, we can see rulers who copy elements of this. How to rule a citizenry, how to rule a group of citizens is many times following in Pharaoh's, those things that I just listed to you, rewriting the history, shaming, demoralizing, taking away any sense of success, any sense of self-purpose. They had all of that. But Pharaoh was very unique, though. If you think about it, Most dictators in history are actually very nervous. They're scared, they're paranoid. And therefore, they're killing people left and right. Anyone who dares to speak up, anyone who challenges them, dead, dead, dead. See this all the time. Pharaoh was not acting from a place of paranoia. He was afraid of a Jewish revolt, absolutely. But he was so confident in his ability to rule as a god, which he proclaimed himself to be, that he didn't necessarily care that the Jewish people came to the palace. Moses and Aaron were able to come and taunt him and threaten him without any repercussion. Of course, it was miraculous. But from Pharaoh's standpoint, to Pharaoh, this was a great. You're going to come challenge me. I'm not thin air. I'm a dictator, but I have a backbone. And so he is thought out. He is very detailed, and he puts this final step into place. And how do we know that his plan actually worked? And for that, I want to pull up a text. I'm going to share the screen. Bear with me. Yeah. This is what it says. After Moses and Aaron, you have the Hebrew on the right and the English on the left. After Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh and said to Pharaoh, the Jewish God commands that you let the Jewish people out. Pharaoh, of course, doesn't care for that. And in fact, he says, now we're not going to supply the Jewish people with the raw material, the straw. They're going to have to create their own bricks and find their own raw material. Here you see something incredible, incredibly sad, but you also see this effectiveness of Pharaoh's 6-step strategy to subdue the Jewish people mentally and in every other way. It says the Jewish taskmasters met Moses and Aaron standing before them when they came out from Pharaoh's presence. And they said to them, to Moses and Aaron, may the Lord look upon you and judge, for you have brought us into foul odor in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of his servants, to place a sword in their hands to kill us. Okay? What is this telling us? Here we have Moses has finally come to the Jewish people to save them, to let them know that God has heard your cries and he is setting in motion the plan of your redemption. But yet, who are they angry at? Who do the Jewish people turn their attention to? And they say to Moses and Aaron, your fault, you're causing us pain, you're tormenting our tormentors, which means you came to save us, but they didn't see that. They saw Moses and Aaron as the bad people in this situation. And this wasn't just all the Jews. This was even these taskmasters who, as we said before, when it came that moment of truth, they took the decision to get hit. But they were also sucked into that mentality. They were so absorbed by slavery that they didn't recognize that they should be mad at Pharaoh. Go tell God to judge Pharaoh. They're telling God to judge Moses and Aaron for making it worse in the eyes of Pharaoh. Seems quite the opposite. And in fact, there's a term for this. The term is Stockholm Syndrome. And the Stockholm Syndrome is precisely this. When people in victim situations go and protect their attackers. We see this with hostages and terrorists, abusers, many situations. The victim becomes so reliant, so dependent on the attacker, on the aggressor, on the abuser, whatever case it is, that they turn to protect them. And I want to read to you again, I'm going to quote. This is the first finding when they coined the term Stockholm Syndrome. And I don't believe it's an actual diagnosis. It's more of an idea that is apparent. We see it all the time. And I'll quote, people have likely experienced this syndrome for a long time, but it was first named in 1973 by Nils Bejerot, a criminologist in Stockholm. He used the term to explain the unexpected reaction hostages of a bank raid had toward their captor. Despite being held against their will in a life-threatening situation, these individuals made positive relationships with their captors. They even helped them pay for their lawyers after they were caught. That tells you of the psychological damage being subdued by somebody else, by another human being can have. And that is precisely where the Jewish people were at, including these taskmasters. That is where they were. They were put into an impossible situation. Think about, again, we quoted earlier, the couples in Nazi Germany. Impossible situation. Here they are. They were in the thick of it as well. Another prime example is in communist Russia. The communist government had a wing of the government, a branch dedicated to eradicate Judaism as we know it today. And this branch of Judaism, this branch of the communist government was called the Yevsektia. They were a group of Jews who turned against their own tradition and heritage, absolutely turned against it. And they went on a mission to hunt down any vestige of Jewish practice, any. They tormented anyone who continued to follow any type of religious life. And they were dangerously successful. They did more to eradicate Judaism from that part of the world than the rest of the communist part. And what do we see there? Again, the same idea, where to conquer a person, it's not only physical death. There's this strategy, this mental idea of taking your own and turning them against each other. These were Jews turning against other Jews. And what happened? They were beaten. Let's have a look at text 2. So Pharaoh orders, just to give you context here, Pharaoh orders that there no longer be straw given to the Jewish workers. So the people scattered throughout the entire land of Egypt to gather a gleaning for stubble. Verse 13. And the taskmasters were pressing him, saying, finish your work, the requirement of each day in its day, just as when there was stubble. And the officers of the children of Israel, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had appointed over them, were beaten, saying, why have you not completed your quota to make bricks like the day before yesterday, neither yesterday nor today? If you look very carefully, who was beaten? The Jewish officers, the taskmasters. They took the beating. Says Rashi, let's look at that. And the officers of the children were beaten. The officers were Israelites, and they had pity on their fellows, and they did not press them as they were told to. They would turn the bricks over to the taskmasters, who were Egyptians, and when something was missing from the required amount, they, the Egyptians, would flog them, the officers, because they did not press the workers. Okay. So what happens to these taskmasters who, again, as we saw, they were not great prophets. They were not great sages necessarily. They were enslaved the same as every other Jew, and possibly they had it worse. They were put into an even more difficult situation. And they were completely in. It wasn't like they were the ones shouting and saying, we're going to get through this, we're going to come out, hold on tight, where's your faith? No, they also turned against Moses. But yet, at that crucial moment, when it mattered, me or you, they said me. It's going to be me. I am going to take the flog. And what happens? Are they merely forgotten? No, absolutely not. God sees the pain and suffering that they took upon themselves and prevented other Jews from receiving. And God blesses them with the divine spirit. They were endowed with the gift of prophecy. They later prophesied and became great prophets. What happened? Well, let's go back a moment. There were others who were put into positions of leadership and they failed. I'll give you an example. When Moses and Aaron were told, when Moses was told to go to Pharaoh for the first time, he said, Aaron, your brother, God said, Aaron's going to accompany you. And by the way, if there's anything I'm saying and I'm just glossing over, please come back to me on it. Just I don't want to get caught up with other details. So Moses and Aaron go, but he says that there were elders of the people who went with. But yet, we look carefully at the verses. There's no mention of these elders once the discussion with Pharaoh begins. The question is why? Where are they? And we're told that as they came closer and closer to Pharaoh, they started getting scared. And one by one, they trickled off. They were too scared. They said, I'm not in for this. I'm too scared. I'm paranoid of Pharaoh. So only Moses and Aaron go. 70 elders slip away, and Moses and Aaron stand up. So we see right there, and this was without any physical threats. They were too scared to stand up for the Jewish people, and they don't get any credit for that. But these taskmasters did not back up. Many years later in the desert, as the Jewish people are traveling from Egypt to the land of Israel for 40 years, there's a moment where, many moments, but there's a specific moment when the Jewish people are complaining. They're complaining about food, that they want meat. And Moses turns to God, frustrated almost, if we can say that. And he says, I cannot carry the burden. I cannot carry this load by myself. I can't. And God says, okay, I will endow prophecy to 70 elders, and they will assist you. And right there is a very powerful moment. Because right there, Moses uses the words, I cannot bear the burden alone. And God turns to Moses and says, wait a second. I know of a group of people who can bear the burden with you. How do I know they can bear the burden? Because they already did. They have the scars and the beatings to prove it. And those 70 taskmasters who continued on into the desert were chosen for prophecy because they had proven, not with their words, not with slogans, and not with campaign rallies, but with their actions. Their sweat and blood proved it. That when Moses says, how can I carry this burden alone? God says, I know who can, because they've already carried it and they have the evidence and the proof of it. And these Jewish people these taskmasters, Jewish taskmasters, are given this blessing. And again, we don't see that they were any greater than the other Jewish people at that moment. But their difference was that in that impossible situation, when the unthinkable was in front of them, they made a choice that made a difference in everyone else's lives. What does that tell us, each one of us today, many, many years later? Thank God we are not in a situation where we have to make unthinkable choices. But we can remind ourselves what it means to be dedicated to one another. And this can be on many levels. Yes, physically we can, if necessary, of course. But I don't know how realistic that is. Thank God we don't have these struggles. Financially, we can. Emotionally, we can. Intellectually, we can make sacrifices for others. And I want to share with you a couple of contemporary examples, because I think it brings to light this idea that, yes, these are heroes who made the greatest of sacrifices, but at the same time, the Torah tells us about them so that we can learn from them. So the first is a financial sacrifice, not just a financial sacrifice, but a sacrifice that comes with dignity. You may have heard of the Rothschild family, very wealthy Jewish family. Where did they get their wealth? What's the story behind it? It's very unusual. It's unnatural, the fact that their wealth continued and continued for such a great way for generation after generation. So the story goes that the patriarch of the Rothschild family was a man named Moshe Anshel. And Moshe Anshel was a young man, unmarried, and he needed a job. So he went to a town in Poland and he served as the assistant to the rabbi there, help him out in all different ways, be his attendant, answer the door, take care of his meetings, help distribute whatever needed to be distributed, so on. And one day Moshe Anshel turns to the rabbi, his mentor, and he says, you know, I think it's time for me to get married, to move on with my life. I'm going to travel to a nearby town, and God willing, I'll set myself up there. Of course, the two embraced. Very dedicated man Moshe Anshel was. He was very, very devoted, always on time, very pious, respectful. And the rabbi's, sad to see him go, but happy that he's going to start his own life somewhere else. They move on. A few months later, it's the holiday of Passover. And as the Jewish law requires, the night before Passover, we do the search for chametz. When we go around the house with a candle, and we check through everything just to make sure that we haven't forgotten a single scrap of chametz. So there's the rabbi going around his home, and he is checking for chametz. And as he's checking his desk, he opens up a drawer, a secret drawer, and that is where he kept a purse of 500 gulden, a large sum of money, which was used to help orphans, help the poor, widows, people in town who needed a little bit of financial support. And this drawer was a secret, and nobody knew about it. But every Passover, the rabbi would check there because that's what Jewish law required. And to his utter horror, the money's gone. It's nowhere to be found. And he pushes around the desk and he checks the other drawers. He checks the bookshelves. Maybe it was misplaced. It's gone. He pushes it out of his mind during the holiday. But right after the holiday, he thinks to himself, right after Passover, he says, it's hard for me to think like this, but let's be honest. I knew about the money and Moshe Anshel knew about the money. He's the only other person who knew the whereabouts of this purse. It must be that he took it. It could be that he was getting married and he felt embarrassed that he would go into his wedding without too much. Maybe he's planning to pay it back, but it must have been him. And he must have been in very dire straits that he took it, but it must have been him. And with that in mind, the rabbi gets into a wagon, travels to the nearby town where Moshe Anshel was newly married, working his own little job, making pennies a day. And he comes there, he greets him, and then he says, the real reason I'm here is because the purse is missing. And I know, Moshe Anshel, that you were planning to pay me back and you did it for your wedding and you didn't mean any harm. And right then, Moshe Anshel's face turns white and he breaks down in bitter tears. And he runs out of the room and he comes back with a little bag and he starts counting out money. And as he's finished counting, he gets to 250 gulden and he says, here you go. And he says, Rabbi, I promise I'm going to send you the rest back. And the rabbi blesses him and says, Moshe Anshel, God will forgive you. And I know that it was a very hard decision that you had to make. And thank you for owning up and being honest. And on his way home, the rabbi's thinking, wow, an honest person made a mistake, was tempted, was challenged. And here he is admitting to it and fixing it right away. Very, very impressive young man. And sure enough, Moshe Anshel worked extra hours, scraping penny by penny, and he sent back all the money to the rabbi. A year or so later, the rabbi's studying in his office, and there's an urgent knock on the door. And the chief of police is there, says, you must come to the station immediately. Of course, the rabbi is very nervous. What good could that be? In Poland, being summoned to the chief of police, what trouble's brewing? He says, come, I'll explain you everything. And he says, well, Rabbi, the chief of police says to the rabbi, he says, Rabbi, let me ask you a question. Did you have any thefts recently? Was anything missing from your home? The rabbi's thinking, how could anyone know about it? But he says, yes, in fact, there was. I had this attendant, 500 gulden were missing, but it's all taken care of. I have the money back. And the chief of police is all confused, and he says, 1 second. And he calls his sergeant. He says, Sergeant, bring her in. And in walks this Russian, Polish peasant woman, and she looks very sad, distraught, nervous. And he says, Rabbi, do you recognize her? And she says, no, I don't. He says, well, Rabbi, this was actually a woman who worked in your home. And what's the story? The story is that she stopped working by you a few months ago. Why? Well, her friends started noticing that she started buying fancy boots and clothing, and they got suspicious, so they reported her activities. Sure enough, we followed her, and we found that she had dug some money under a tree in the backyard, and we knew it was stolen money, and it's yours. So now the rabbi realizes that Moshe Anshel was never guilty. It was the cleaning lady who stole the money, and he was willing to give of his own money, not say a word in his defense, to defend his dignity, his character, and his finances. And the rabbi quickly runs back to Moshe Anshel and says, I'm so sorry, please forgive me. Why didn't you say anything? And Moshe Anshel says simply, I saw the pain on your face. You were so distraught by not being able to help the people in your town that I simply gave you that money. And that's what he does. He gives him that money. That moment, the rabbi blesses him with wealth, with great wealth and success in his business life. And that is how the great Rothschild family started, from that act of self-sacrifice where he put his own needs aside, recognizing that the needs of fellow Jews were more important at that moment. And then, on a lighter note, there's an emotional sacrifice that we sometimes have to make. And this reminds me of Thomas Edison. There's a famous story, and the details are up for scrutiny, but the idea stands. Thomas Edison has a famous note that he brought home from school one day. And he said, "Mom, this note is from my teacher. She said only you can read it." And the mother opens the note and reads out loud to her young son, Thomas, and says, "Thomas is too smart for our class. He's a real genius, and we do not have the ability to handle him here." So that's what happens. He leaves school and he goes on to become a great guy. After his mother dies, he finds the note. And this is what the note said: "Your son is mentally deficient. We cannot let him attend our school anymore. He is expelled." That is also a sacrifice, because often to defend ourselves, to make ourselves feel good, we are okay and comfortable with putting down others, even if it's people we love. We're in a socially demanding situation, and somebody who we know or we love does something awkward, we may throw them under the bus, quote unquote, to defend ourselves. And here's a mother who is willing to say, "No, I am not going to pass this dagger, this piece of poison to my son. I'm going to hold it to myself. Whatever pain that's going to cause me, I'll keep it so that my son can succeed." And ultimately, that's exactly what happens. Had he not been given that opportunity, who knows where we would be today as well. But now there's one more point I want to make before I draw the class to a close. And that is on the flip side. The taskmasters, they came through. They had the courage. They did the impossible. When they were faced with the unthinkable, they made a great decision. But that also reminds us that we can never truly appreciate the situation that others are in. And when we see someone making a decision that seems morally incorrect, that seems deplorable, that seems really wrong in every way, we can never judge them, because we do not appreciate the impossibility of their situation the way they see it. And so we are reminded that things are complex, and they may be more complex than we can ever imagine. And how do you know how you would react in a similar situation? You don't know. You don't know how you would respond if you were put to that test. And this is a point that the Rabbi Schneerson was very adamant about, that we can never judge others. And not only is it about not judging, but it's also about finding every conscionable reason for the good of others. It's very, very important. And the story goes, very briefly, of a journalist, a writer, who came to the Rebbe, and he told the Rebbe that I wrote this thing about positivity and judging others favorably, and he wants to hear the Rebbe's opinion, right? So what happens is, it's a very fascinating thing, because the Rebbe says, how can you know how anyone would react under any circumstance? Given the horrific circumstances, it's perhaps understandable that there may be what looks like treason to us, what seems like the impossible to us. And so therefore, we should never judge and cast dispersions on anyone, no matter what. And then the Rebbe asked this author, he says, "You have a book, it's called On the Line." In this book, the author fascinatingly discusses a idea of, it was got to do with the automobile industry. And the author wanted to show how their work impacts their life, right? So the Rebbe turns to this author and says, when you were writing this book, this fictional book, but trying to bring real life scenarios to it, says, what conclusions did you come to, right? So for example, these workers were in very difficult situations. The work atmosphere, the environment wasn't great. So the Rebbe asks him, in your fictional work, what steps did your characters take to free themselves from these conditions? Did you maybe say that they should protest and demonstrate and so on? Should they make a revolt while they're chained to their machines? And the author says, of course not, Rebbe. That would have been very unrealistic. And that moment, his name was Harvey. Harvey, this author, recognized what the Rebbe was telling him. It's exactly right. Even in your own fictional work, you don't expect your workers to revolt against the bosses. So how can we sit here and go back and judge and say what we would have done or what they should have done? We weren't there, we don't know. And ultimately, we pray that we should never be put into such a situation. Okay, love to hear your thoughts. We're fascinating.